Hi everyone, I'm Stan Mallow. Welcome to Paranormal Yakker. My guest in today's show is Nicole Strickland. She's a well-respected afterlife and paranormal researcher, author, podcaster, and speaker, and founder, director, and case manager of the San Diego Paranormal Research Society. Nicole is also the Ghost Research Society's California coordinator and is a consultant to other investigative teams. I'll be talking with Nicole about her book, The Afterlife Chronicles, exploring the connection between life, death, and beyond. Nicole Strickland, welcome to Paranormal Yakker.
Hello, Stan. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on your show. This is exciting.
When, Nicole, did you develop an interest in the paranormal? What was there about it that attracted you to it? And to be more specific, what was there about the branch of the paranormal that deals with the afterlife that got your attention?
Oh, great question. I like to say that in a way, I was born into this field because ever since I was a young child, I always had this unique fascination and curiosity about what happens to us when we pass on. This curiosity and this fascination with ghosts and the spirit realm and the afterlife. And even as a young girl, I had this innate knowing that there's more to the equation than just us here on planet Earth. There's something else there. Growing up, I would read anything I could on the subject, watch anything I could. And so that interest really stayed with me. And I had experiences as far back as I can remember. My very first one that I can remember, I was about 4.5 years old when I was living in Las Vegas, Nevada. My interest in the paranormal, even in the afterlife, stayed with me. It culminated into a very, very profound experience with the spirit of my maternal grandmother, Helen Lopinto. When I was a senior at the University of Arizona, she called me, just to paraphrase, she called me the night before she passed and wanted to know if I was okay. And I thought, well, that's odd, but she's grandmother. She always worried about the family, so I didn't really think much of it. I talked with her for about 20 minutes or so, had a great conversation. Fast forward to the next day, her daughter, of course, my mom, called me, and I could tell by the tone of my mom's name is Norma, I could tell the tone of Norma's voice that something terrible happened. She proceeded to say, Nicole, I love you so much. And then came the words, but Grandma passed away early in the morning. And this was October 25th. 2001. I was devastated, came back out because I was attending the University of Arizona, came back out to San Diego where my family is, spent a few days with the family. And then when I went back to Tucson, Arizona, I started having odd experiences in my apartment that I didn't experience prior to her death. Now, initially, I chalked them away as, okay, it's vibration. I live in an upstairs unit. It's my neighbors making noise, what have you. But it started with the doorknob, specifically the front doorknob, and then the doorknob to my bedroom would occasionally move as if someone was trying to open it. Again, I didn't think much of it. A couple of nights later, I was writing, I think doing a paper or something. I didn't see anything, but I felt what felt like a hand touch my face, and it felt very comforting, as if it came from someone I knew and loved. That's when I started to think, okay, could this be Helen communicating with me, or is this me? Am I projecting it because I was grieving? Is this some sort of bereavement hallucination on my part? Again, a couple of nights later, give or take, it all culminated into, again, I was on my bed, on my computer, when all of a sudden, out of my left peripheral vision, I saw Helen, full-bodied, in spirit form. It looked as though she had a halo behind her, like shining against her back. She looked about 10, 15 years younger, wearing a beautiful dress. She looked vibrant, healthy. She didn't say anything, but had a slight smile on her face, and it seemed to play out in slow motion, and then I saw her fade. After that, I started to connect the dots. But again, I thought, am I doing this? Am I projecting this somehow? And that's something that I thought about. And so I called my mom up and talked with her. And I even asked other family members if they're experiencing anything. And sure enough, no one did. I apparently was the only one. And so I like to think that she came and visited. And she was always intuitive, innately intuitively inclined, if you will. That kind of passed down the maternal line. I think she knew before I did that in a way I was destined for this field. In a way, I credit her for really getting me on the path. And it was after this experience that I really started to investigate the paranormal. And I know that there's different branches, and I'm all interested in all of them, but I've always specialized in spirit communication, ghosts, haunted locations. And then really in the last few years, my interest in the afterlife really started to take effect as well. Now I'm really focused on looking into the soul survival after death, NDEs, reincarnation, aspects about that, because I do believe that our soul lives on. And so just everything else fell into place. Here I am today talking with you, and here we are. It's been a really good journey so far.
Everyone, I'm certain, at one time or another, has asked themselves, what happens to us when we die? Does the human soul survive after death? How can we communicate with loved ones in the spirit world? The Afterlife Chronicles addresses all of those questions and more. How, Nicole, can someone recognize the signs of and reasons why the spirit world reaches out to the living and, as you say, vice versa?
Good question. I like to think that both worlds, our world and the afterlife, I like to think that there's always been this kind of parallel interrelationship between both worlds. But I started to think nowadays there's so much trauma and turmoil and a lot of challenges people are facing. I'm wondering if that could be one of the reasons why it seems that both worlds are now communicating with each other a little bit more. Of course, society's interest in the paranormal is greater. The paranormal is now highly infused in our society, but I like to think that there's just another greater reason for that. And so I think that people too are realizing more and more people are not afraid to share their experiences. It's not as taboo as it once was anymore. And people are starting to be open about their desires to communicate with departed loved ones, sharing their experiences that they've had. And I think all of that is in a way almost acting as like a capacitor, like a battery that fuels this relationship that we have with the afterlife. I think more people are more in tune to recognizing the signs that the afterlife is reaching out to us and vice versa, whether it be through synchronicity or dream visitations or just being more heightened to one's surroundings and noticing these little signs. I think that it's this relationship that we've always had is really growing and really becoming one interrelationship, if that makes sense.
It does indeed. What, Nicole, are the similarities and differences on how various cultures look at the afterlife?
Interesting. I found when doing research is that a lot of cultures will absolutely believe that life exists once we pass on, but maybe there's differences into exactly what happens to the human body or exactly where do we go. Some believe in reincarnation, others don't. Some may believe that the soul may evolve through various stages, others don't. Again, there's this general belief that life does exist when we move on, but maybe exactly what happens to us may differ a little bit with different cultures, like Buddhism, reincarnation. For example, the Egyptians used to really take care of the body, preserve it, just different beliefs in exactly what happens to the body, but generally we all feel that there is life beyond death. That's kind of like my answer to that.
In what ways, Nicole, has the spiritualist movement influenced modern-day spirit communication and paranormal research?
Yeah, this is a good question. Just as we know, the spiritualist movement, it started in central upstate New York in the 1840s and lasted until about the 1920s. And it primarily started with two sisters that lived in Hydesville, New York. We have Kate and Margaret Fox. And so spiritualists believe that the afterlife does exist, that we can communicate with those in the afterlife, and that those in the afterlife have a greater knowledge of just humanity and just a greater knowledge about the universe, so to speak. A lot of people after Kate and Margaret started showing signs that they were psychic. Of course, that there was a lot of fraudulence and whatnot with the movement, but it got a lot of people interested in wanting to communicate with departed loved ones and connect with those in life beyond. And so a lot of other women, even men, really tried to get used to their psychic skills and develop their skills. And so that's where, a lot of people did seances and things of that nature. And what's interesting about the movement for me is that it provided the first scientific framework to study scientifically the paranormal. And so that's when the Society for Psychical Research was formed. And so I find that's very interesting, and that it really fueled researching the paranormal from a science-based perspective. I do think that there's a lot of maybe things or approaches that we use today may mirror approaches that were used in the spiritualist movement, but it also taught us to become more, I guess, observant of some of the fraud and the deceit that went on in the movement. But another interesting thing, too, is with the Civil War. I think it was around like 2 million more people because of the Civil War, because people lost loved ones in the Civil War. 2 million plus more people got interested in really wanting to communicate with the other side. I really do think it kind of gave us that impetus to really want to foster the connection that we have with the other side. And of course, scientifically explain, or not explain, maybe explain, but scientifically study the paranormal.
What role does intuition and mind, body, spirit play in us connecting with the afterlife?
Yeah, this is a big chapter in the book, and intuition and psychic senses, channeling, I think they're cousins. They're not necessarily the same, but they interrelate. For those that may be confused, intuition is just kind of having that gut feeling. So for example, let's say you're driving on the highway. You have that little voice inside of you saying, okay, what? I better get off on the next exit. I don't want to drive any further. And then you later find out, okay, maybe there wasn't obviously an accident up the road. Whereas channeling, which involves that intuition, an example would be, let's say you're investigating a private house or a historic building, and all of a sudden someone gets a sense of maybe an older man, maybe from the 1920s. They may see what he looks like in their mind's eye, getting that kind of idea of who that person may be. That's more of channeling. I think that really to effectively channel and effectively work with the spirit realm, you must be centered. You must be healthy from a physical, spiritual, emotional state. And not only that, but I think one must trust his or her own intuition and innate psychic channeling senses, because I'm of the belief, and I've talked to a lot of other people about this too, and they feel the same way, that all of us have the capacity to channel a spirit, directly communicate with an entity. Some are just a little bit more open to it, maybe a little bit more practiced at it. I equate it to like a sport. If you practice soccer over and over and over, your skills are going to get better. And so that's what I found about me. I've always been innately intuitive my whole life, but just being involved in the paranormal and out doing the work, I've found that my senses have increased and have gotten a little bit more fine-tuned. I think having that trust in your intuition, having your faith in your own innate psychic senses and fostering that will really go a long way in helping you to communicate. And then, of course, realizing that communicating with the other side, it's best done from a humble state, leave ego at the table, done from a state where you're completely grounded. So that's where meditation may come in, and everyone may meditate differently. Some like to do it when they're walking. Others may take 5 minutes. Some may meditate for 30 minutes. There's really no right or wrong way to it, but it just provides that nice foundation for you to have a wonderful connection with the other side.
In the Afterlife Chronicles, you explore near-death experiences and the keys to understanding life after death. Can you, Nicole, elaborate on that?
The gateways to communicating with the other side. And this is a personal opinion of mine, right? I mean, I'm no expert. I think that near-death experiences, synchronicity, and dream visitations can be three really solid ways to connect with the other side. So, near-death experiences, people in my research, people from all walks of life, children, males, females from all over the world, different backgrounds, who have these near-death experiences or even like a shared death experience, they find that their innate psychic senses are heightened. A lot of the traits are similar. So they may lose interest in material goods. They're more into like altruism. They're, like I said, their psychic senses develop a little bit better, and they just they have this sense of wanting to do better and do, I guess, better, not just for ourselves, but for humanity at large. A lot of these traits that people develop after having an NDE, or even some of the experiences while going through an NDE, are really similar. And a lot of these stories, and I've read so many of them, and I've even talked to people that have had NDEs, near-death experiences, they will talk about going to this paradise, this beautiful place. The colors are like more vibrant than here on Earth. They'll talk about how they can maybe mold the area where they are to match his or her culture. Just a place of just all-knowing love and peace, being reunited with departed loved ones, animals. I just lost my 23-year-old cat on Saturday, so I'm been really hard. So I find that near-death experiences really can give us a glimpse, maybe not tell us everything of what awaits for us, but can give us a glimpse into what awaits us on the other side. And even aspects such as synchronicity, which was coined by Carl Jung. You have these two scenarios that really by themselves don't mean anything, but somehow there's this connection between the two of them. And speaking from my own experiences, as well as talking to other ones, I do think that those in the afterlife, our departed loved ones, even animals, will use synchronous signs as a way to let us know how they're doing, or just tell us that they're okay, just letting us know everything's okay. And then, of course, dream visitations as well, I think are really, and I have profound stories with that, specifically regarding my cat, Kaylee. And I wouldn't have necessarily thought this prior, but in a way, she's taught me a lot about dream visitations. We're not just talking about typical dreams that we have every night, maybe that our subconscious is processing our daily trials and tribulations. We're talking about in our dream state, we're able to have this communication or connection with those that have passed on. I've had about 23, 24 of these regarding my cat, Kaylee. And what's interesting is that in the dream visitation, it's always the same environment. It's the same lighting, the same room. I'm laying down as I actually am when I'm asleep. And Kaylee, who left on December 19th, 2021, she comes to me and I'm able to feel her. I'm able to see her. I'm able to communicate with her. And just very, very strong sense of love and peace when I wake up from these. I find that those three near-death experiences, synchronicity, and dream visitations are three really strong gateways for us to really connect with the other side.
Well, when it comes to the afterlife, you have found that there are a number of misconceptions people have about it. Can you, Nicole, tell me about some of those misconceptions?
Sure. And this is just my opinion. You know, some other people may have others that I didn't even think of. But I think that in this, and I don't want to knock entertainment or Hollywood or anything, but I think that the television shows and whatnot like to portray and give us misinformation in terms of exactly what maybe a ghost or an earthbound energy or a spirit is. And so there's often a portrayal of them being scary and evil and this and that, wanting to do harm. And I found through my experiences and even talking to numerous other people that that's actually not really the case. That's a big misconception that I have, is just giving us the idea that, okay, ghosts and spirits are here to be feared. They're here to be scared of. They want to do us harm. And that's just really not the case at all. That's Hollywood. We have to remember about ratings. You have to remember fear sells, right? That concept of fear sells. I think it causes some people to have a hard time to blur those lines of reality versus fantasy. And so people that don't necessarily have a knowledge of the paranormal or really are new at working with spiritual energies, they may inadvertently be gullible and listen to a lot of this and then themselves become feared over something that maybe they shouldn't fear in the first place. I think that that's one of the strong misconceptions. Another one is, how certain types of equipment that we use on paranormal investigations, and there's a lot, environmental monitoring, cameras, different audio recording devices. You often see sometimes they're not used properly on certain shows, or if they're not used properly, or if they are used properly, not really a good explanation of why they're used, especially in paranormal research. If I remember about that chapter, that's mainly what I was getting into, is that not to believe in the inherent thought that these shows like to give us that, okay, ghosts and spirits, evil. That's not the case. Someone may have a negative experience. Let's say you are investigating maybe at a former lunatic asylum, and maybe you're encountering an earthbound entity there that was very mentally ill, and maybe you have a negative experience. but don't automatically equate that as being a demon. That's another misconception, is using the words negative and malevolent, because malevolent can be human. That can apply to human energy as well. So these terms of, oh, that was demonic and that was negative, there's a huge difference between something that's negative versus something that's demonic. And I think it's very rare for, out of all the cases that have come about that where people think they might have a demon in their house, I think the percentages of it actually being authentically malevolent or demonic are extremely, extremely rare. That's another misconception too. I know that, and I've talked to other research teams about this too, especially in the last few years. I would say maybe in the last 5 or 6 years, there's an increase in people writing paranormal teams, such as my team, thinking that they have some sort of demon or very, very scary, malevolent being in their house. And I really do think that it could be that all these shows that are giving off the impression that everything is evil, everything is malevolent, and that's just not the case. And that was a controversial chapter to put in there, but I chose to do it just because, based on my experiences and talking with many, many other people, I like to think that most of the energy out there is good as opposed to the latter.
There are traditional and alternative methods for communicating with this spirit world. You address both of them in your book. Can you, Nicole, give me an example of each type of method?
I use the word traditional mainly to talk about or discuss and a lot of people cringe at the word science and paranormal, but I will use it, more science-based approaches versus the esoteric or metaphysical approaches. Traditional approaches would be using audio experimentation, doing electronic voice phenomena sessions. An EVP, or electronic voice phenomena, is a voice or maybe a phrase that we don't hear with our audible ear at the time, but it's captured when we go and review our audio. And then we have disembodied vocalizations, which are like EVPs. They're captured on recording devices, but they are heard audibly at the time of recording. EVP sessions, also instrumental transcommunication, which is basically real-time communication. It was coined by Ernst Sinkowski in the 1970s, just basically real-time communication. You can have that on TVs, answering machines, but nowadays people will use certain devices like ghost boxes, spirit boxes. Two common ones are the PSB-7, PSB-11 that scan the AM and FM bands of radio at a very rapid frequency. It's thought that spiritual energies can utilize that frequency in bits of sound to communicate with us. That can be very subjective because you want to make sure that you don't accidentally mistake maybe a radio fragment for something, like a spirit coming through. When we employ those types of methods, we look for clarity. Are the responses or voices that come through, are they easy to hear? Are they historically relevant? Are they coinciding with the discussions we're having? And if that's the case and it's something that is clearly heard, then it's probably more likely that it's not some sort of radio fragment. And then another method, it's more recent, is the Estes method, which was coined by, I forget their names. It was the Stanley Hotel, I think Connor Randall, Michelle Tate, and I'm forgetting the other person that developed it. It's kind of like the Gansfield experiments in the 70s, sensory deprivation. You can do 2 people, you can do more than 2, but you'll have someone acting as the operator and then someone as the receiver. The operator is going to be the person that's asking the questions in a different area. And then you'll have the receiver who is blindfolded and can only hear the scanning of the device. The receiver does not hear the operator's questions. Using that sensory deprivation type of experimentation, a lot of good results have come from that. I've used it a few times, and I've actually had some interesting results. 2 of my friends in the Midwest, Nicole Tito and Lisa Crick, they do this method all the time, and they've had some interesting results, almost like and again, the receiver doesn't hear the operator's questions, but yet when the receiver is picking up information that's pertaining to the operator's questions without hearing those questions, that's interesting. And so they've found that happens a lot on their experimentation. And then using environmental monitoring, monitoring the electromagnetic field. It's thought that places that emit a lot of EMF or that have high EMF can be like a good foundation for ghostly phenomena. Measuring temperature, It's thought that, you probably heard this before, that temperature drops could mean maybe that a spiritual being is using the energy, thus dropping the temperature. Sometimes there's an increase in temperature as well. That's more rare. Measuring ionic energy, all kinds of different environmental monitoring. Radiation, for example, is used, as well as cameras. You're going to have even those like hunter trap cameras that can take still photos in infrared, or they can record like a snippet of like maybe 5 seconds of video. Again, it's based on sense. A lot of these trap cameras are used mostly IR. You have full spectrum cameras. You have security cameras, surveillance monitoring devices that can be used mostly in IR. SLX, I haven't used this much. I hear pros and cons with it. The SLS Connect camera, which can give you like stick figure images of what may look like a figure if that figure is there. All these different types of technology out there which are used. I come from the basis of, and this is how I investigate. Again, I'm not an expert, but I think less is more. I've been on investigations where people will have tons of gadgets just surrounding themselves. And you have to think about, okay, one, how do the ghosts and how do spirits react to some of this technology? Because in most cases, they didn't have that back then. Could this technology harm them? Is that possible? In terms of investigators that use a lot of technology, I find that their time, whether it's 6 hours or 8 hours, is spent monitoring all the gadgets, and then they lose out on monitoring the environment around them. I'm often asked, okay, what is the best piece of equipment? My answer is yourself. Our bodies, our senses. Man-made technology comes second. Different kinds of traditional types of investigating: audio, communication, photography, using different types of video cameras, environmental monitoring. And then you have the esoteric methods. The most common that are used are using like divining rods and pendulums. And so they kind of using the same principle. I like to think of it as like an adjunct to, for example, like divining rods are an adjunct to maybe doing EVP sessions. You can have someone with the rods, designating the rods to cross for yes questions, separate out for no, just as an example. And we've had that on cases where we might get a yes response as an EVP, and then the rods also cross for yes as well. Whenever you can connect two pieces of the puzzle, or seemingly connect two pieces of the puzzle, that's great. And then pendulums as well, kind of used, same principle, used as an adjunct for questioning. A lot of people like to use quartz or rose quartz. With divining rods, my thought is, for those that like to use them, the longer they are, the more sensitive they are. Copper varieties for me work better. I've heard other people say that as well, just because of its conductive properties. A lot of people will employ crystals as well during investigations, all kinds of different crystals. Smudging is another one that you can use to, like sage, to help purify a location or kind of cleanse the energy, if you will. There's also mirror scrying. Now, I've not really done this too much. I know people that have. My dear friend, Rosemary Ellen Guiley, who is now in the afterlife herself, used it a lot. And so it's the thought of, I don't know if you've ever used mirror scrying, but it's the thought, and there's different ways to do it. She actually used like a black surface, and it's the thought of really staring into that mirror, almost in a meditative state, to see what types of energy you'll get, see if you see anything. There's water scrying as well, where people can fill a bowl of water and then just kind of watch. And sometimes some people will take pictures of it. And then I've seen actual pictures where it looks like there's maybe a face or something like that. Whether or not that's pareidolia, I don't know. There's all these different techniques. Some will be more traditional. Other teams primarily work from an intuitive metaphysical standpoint. I like to blend the two. I feel it gives a more holistic type of approach to working with the spirit realm, and every single location you go into is going to be different. We like to cater the types of methodology we use and the types of equipment we use to the claims going on initially. And then after that, if we were to, let's say there's a place that is primarily audio heavy and we go in using a lot of audio methodology and we were to get a lot of responses, then we may go in again and then start to use other types of methodology as well.
You, Nicole, show your readers how moving through grief and loss can help them connect with departed loved ones. How so?
Grief and loss is one of those it's a touchy subject, and I'm going through that right now. I had to say goodbye to my 23-year-old cat on Saturday night. I'm going to try to not start crying. And everyone goes through grief differently. We know Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was pretty much the godmother of studying grief. And you have different stages. You know, you have the anger, the hope, the depression, the acceptance, the bargaining. These are all stages that we go through. And it's not linear. You could have 10 people and they all go through the stages differently. Before I get into it a little bit more, I will say that my studies in paranormal and afterlife research have helped me cope with death a little bit better. I understand death a little bit better. I know that while I may miss physically a loved one, their physical presence, I do know that my loved one is, always in my heart. Their soul does move on. Their essence, what comprises themselves, that lives on. It's just the body ceases to function. And so that's a concept that really helps me deal with physical death. And I talk about moving through it, how there's no race, there's no right way to do it. My advice is to just let your grief come up as it's supposed to, not to try to suppress it or anything like that. There's things you can do, I believe I talk about in the book as well. For example, like celebrations of life, you may want to go to the nursery and get a plant or flower and plant it in honor of your loved one. You may want to have not a shrine per se, but you may want to put some things up in your house that remind you of your departed loved one, whether it's pictures or candles. Partake in something that they used to love to do while of body. And then also live your life and honoring them while living your life and doing the best you can do. Be kind to others, live altruistically. Doing all that can honor your departed loved one. That's kind of what I talk about in the book, but it's one of the takeaways, and I'll repeat it again for me, studying the paranormal, working with different spiritual beings, even my own departed loved ones, human and animals alike. I will say that it's given me just more of an appreciation for death. It happens to all of us. It's the next phase in our soul's evolution, if you will. Honoring that rite of passage, I think, is really important. And it's just my work has given me more of an understanding of it. It doesn't lessen the grief, but I do know in my heart that, okay, when my mom and dad pass away someday, all right, I'm not going to have them physically, but I know that they're always going to be here. And I hope that people can grasp onto that. Everyone grieves differently. It's one of those things that we all have to do. And it's a universal feeling and a universal experience that we all go through. And in that way, it's unifying.
Many people have shared with you their accounts and stories about the experiences they had with the spirit world and beyond. You have included them in your book. Can you, Nicole, share one or two of those stories?
I'll share a couple. One, Ali Schreiber, she's my dear friend, and she's the team's co-director as well. Her and I work together, San Diego Paranormal Research Society. And there's a story in there, and this I think would fall more along the lines of a dream visitation, where she was dreaming, if I remember correctly, she was dreaming of her dad prior to knowing his passing. And if I remember writing it and remember her dream, she was at the base of the stairs and she looked up and she saw her dad there, and he looked vibrant just as my grandma did. And she was able to go walk up the stairs in the dream, and she was able to hug him and feel his presence and have that comforting moment. And then when she woke up, she later found out that he had passed away. And interestingly, when he did pass away, she thinks it was at the time that she was dreaming. I'm sure there's tidbits of the story I'm not remembering, but that's the gist of it. And then also, this has happened to me too, and again, I think my maternal grandmother, Helen, who I talked about earlier, after she passed away, my mom, even myself, would get phone calls from her landline number, and we'd pick it up and there'd be no one on the other line. It'd be static. There's a story in there, Marie D. Jones, who I just co-authored an anthology with, and another gal, Denise Agnew, and she talks about a story similar to that where I believe it was her grandma, it's been a while since I wrote the book. She got that phone call, static on the other end. If I remember correctly in the story, she didn't know that her grandma had passed yet and got the call that her grandma had passed. But interestingly, I think it was her sister also got a phone call around the same time that she did from the number, and there was static on the other end. Kind of interesting. Another one that really strikes me, William Brower, I believe he's in Florida. He's a big Titanic researcher. And so he had a friend, Gary, I believe his name is, who sadly ended his life. And he talks about that in the story. And Gary, his friend, was a magician. He liked to perform at parties. Gary, William with his girlfriend was attending Gary's celebration of life. They had a group of friends get together after he passed. He went there, celebrated, spent some time with friends for a while, and then on the way back to his car that he had parked a couple of blocks away, he found a latex balloon tied against the antenna of the car, and it was a certain type of balloon that Gary often used during his shows. Now, could someone else have placed the balloon there? Possibly. But again, this is the synchronicity of it. It's, you can't help but think that that's some sort of message from Gary, just letting William know, hey, I'm cool. I'm okay. And so when William actually wrote that story, some of the stories are written from people in their own words. And then others I interviewed and then I transcribed and wrote, and then of course sent it to them for their approval before putting it in the book. And that story by William is actually one that he wrote himself. And so what's interesting about all these personal accounts is that I interweave them throughout the book to almost act as supporting information for the topics that I'm discussing in that particular chapter. And so it's interesting, though, because when writing the book, after I was done with it, I thought, oh, there's way too much information in this book. I'm going to get criticized. But It's actually, that's the one thing that people like. They're like, no, it flows. It's the information that you need. But I initially thought like, oh my gosh, like you could have about 10 or 15, 20 books just from this one book.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to buy the Afterlife Chronicles, exploring the connection between life, death, and beyond, how can they do that? And should they want to get in touch with you, what is your contact information?
The book is sold on various online retailers. Amazon's one of them. It's hardback, paperback, ebook, as well as audiobook through Amazon. Barnes & Noble's another one. Different online retailers. You could just type it in online and see where it comes up. Target has it, Walmart. I think most people might use Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Those are pretty common. My website is NicoleDSandDogStrickland.com. And then I'm on social media. I'm on Facebook. My main page, the handle is Nicole D. Strickland. I have a new show coming out, new podcast, Life Inspiration Project.
Nicole Strickland, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yacker. Yakking with you has been most illuminating. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What an honor to be on your show. You're fabulous. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallon of Paranormal Yacker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. So that you don't miss any upcoming shows, be sure to subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, just press the subscribe button on your screen.